Imagine a world without stoves, without ovens, without the luxuries of modern kitchens. A world where survival itself depended on land and where every meal was a story of resilience, ingenuity, and sacred connection to nature. This is how the first peoples of America prepared their meals without modern tools. Long before supermarkets and microwaves, Native Americans faced the ultimate question. How do you turn what the earth provides into nourishment for the body and spirit? Their answer was both practical and profoundly spiritual. Across hundreds of tribes, from the icy plains of the north to the deserts of the southwest, each community developed its own unique way of cooking, but the methods reveal a universal truth. Human beings have always been masters of adaptation. Historians estimate that over 500 distinct native tribes developed cooking techniques long before modern America existed. They roasted corn on open fires, steamed vegetables in earthen pits, smoked meat to preserve it for winter, and ground seeds into flour using stone mortars that could weigh over 100 pounds. To survive, they had to innovate or perish. Without metal pots, they carved bowls from wood and clay. Without ovens, they dug deep pits in the ground, filled with heated stones, covering food with leaves and earth, creating a natural slow cooker. Without salt, sugar, or spice, they found flavor in smoke, herbs, and the earth itself. Each meal was more than survival. It was ceremony. Every grain of corn, every cut of venison, every berry plucked from the wild carried meaning. Food was not simply eaten, it was honored. To waste was to dishonor the earth. To share was to strengthen the tribe. And so, a meal was never just a meal, it was a reminder of who they were and where they came from. Today, many of us cannot imagine life without a kitchen. Yet the native peoples thrived for centuries with nothing but nature's raw gifts. They remind us that true survival is not found in convenience, but in knowledge, respect, and balance with the world around us. The next time you sit at a table, remember this. The story of food is not just about flavor. It is about survival, memory, and identity. The ancient Native Americans did not need modern tools to nourish their people. All they needed was the earth and the wisdom to use it. Their legacy reminds us that in every grain, every flame, and every shared meal, there is history. How did they prepare meals without modern tools? With fire, with earth, with heart. Imagine a world where the hum of refrigerators never existed, where the click of a stove knob was unknown, and where no pots of steel or pans of iron hung above a kitchen fire. Picture yourself standing in that world, in the heart of an ancient American forest or a wide, open plain, surrounded only by earth, stone, wood, and sky. In such a world, every meal was a test of skill, every bite was earned, and every flame meant survival. The people who lived here, long before skyscrapers, highways, or supermarkets, were the first Native Americans. They faced a simple but profound challenge. How do you transform the raw gifts of the earth into food without the tools we take for granted today? The first spark of curiosity arises when we think about it. What did a mother cook for her children when she had no stove? What did a hunter do with his game when he could not refrigerate or freeze it? How did they even keep fire alive when storms swept across the land? These are the questions that reveal not just the ingenuity of native peoples, but the depth of their bond with the land they called home. In every region of the Americas, from the icy tundras of Alaska to the deserts of the Southwest, the answer was the same. They turned to nature, not as an obstacle, but as a partner. For them, survival was never guaranteed. Winters could be bitterly cold, summers brutally hot, and resources were often unpredictable. Yet they thrived. Why? Because their kitchens were not built of brick and wood. Their kitchens were the earth itself. A glowing fire pit was their stove. A carefully chosen stone was their grinder. A hollowed gourd was their bowl. And the knowledge passed from one generation to another was the true recipe book. Every cooking method was born out of necessity, but perfected with patience and wisdom. At the center of this way of life was fire. The crackling flame was not simply warmth. It was life itself. To make fire meant to cook, to preserve, and to protect. Without modern matches or lighters, fire had to be coaxed from dry wood, struck from stone, or carried carefully from one camp to another. Families treated fire as sacred, tending to it with care, because losing it meant starting again from nothing. Once the fire was alive, It became the heart of every meal. Fish roasted on wooden stakes beside the flames. Corn was toasted directly on embers. Meat was smoked slowly, rising into the air in a way that not only flavored the food, but also preserved it for weeks to come. But cooking was never only about eating. It was about patience, respect, and resourcefulness. Imagine a group gathered around a pit dug into the ground. Stones, heated until they glowed red, were dropped into the pit, and food was carefully placed inside, wrapped in leaves. Then the pit was covered with earth, trapping the heat for hours. This was not quick cooking. This was cooking that demanded waiting, listening, and trusting the process. When the pit was finally opened, steam rose into the air, carrying the rich aroma of roasted meat and vegetables. The meal was not rushed. It was a celebration, and every bite carried the taste of time and earth itself. Think, for a moment, about what it means to cook without tools. No sharp knives to slice, no pans to fry, no spoons to stir. Instead, everything had to be shaped from what was at hand. Stones were chosen not just for strength, but for smoothness, becoming the grinding surfaces for corn and seeds. Clay, molded by hand and hardened by fire, became the first pots and bowls. Wood, carefully carved, became stirring sticks, skewers, and containers. Each object held not just function, but meaning, because every piece had been crafted by someone's hands, often over days or weeks. Now, picture the rhythm of daily life. At dawn, smoke rises from campfires as families prepare their morning meals. Children watch as elders show them how to grind corn, how to recognize herbs, and how to roast food without burning it. The food they ate did not come wrapped in plastic or stored in tins. It came straight from rivers, forests, and plains. There was no separation between meal and landscape. To eat was to connect to the land, to remember that every berry, every grain, and every animal was a gift that demanded gratitude. This world challenges our modern imagination. We live surrounded by tools, appliances, and conveniences, and we assume they are necessary. But the Native Americans remind us that survival never relied on technology. It relied on knowledge. The knowledge of when to hunt, what to gather, how to prepare, and how to preserve. They survived for thousands of years without a single metal pan, and yet they built rich, vibrant food traditions that still inspire us today. The story of how they cook without kitchens is not just about the past. It is about human resilience. It is about understanding that with enough creativity, patience, and respect for nature, people can thrive in any environment. When you think of native cooking, do not imagine scarcity. Imagine abundance, but an abundance shaped by effort, understanding, and care. Imagine the crackle of fire in the night, the smell of roasting fish, the laughter of families gathered, and the deep silence of the wilderness surrounding them. This is the beginning of a journey that will take us through fire pits and clay pots, through smokehouses and stone grinders, through forests and deserts. It is a journey of how the first peoples of America transformed the earth into sustenance, and how every meal was a story of survival, spirit, and connection. Stay with this story, because the deeper we go, the more we uncover the truth. Food was never just food, it was life, culture, and memory. And it all began in a world without kitchens. Food, to the native peoples of ancient America, was never just fuel for the body. It was far more. It carried meaning, it carried ritual, and it carried a sense of belonging. Each meal represented a bond, not only between individuals in a family or tribe, but also between people and the land that sustained them. When a deer was hunted, when corn was harvested, or when berries were gathered in the forest, these were not mere acts of survival. They were acts of reverence, bound tightly to spiritual belief and cultural memory. Imagine, for a moment, sitting in a circle around a fire as the sun begins to set. The meal that is about to be shared is not eaten without thought. Before the first bite, elders might offer thanks to the animals, to the crops, and to the earth itself. Food was never taken for granted. It was sacred. To waste it would have been considered dishonorable, because every grain of corn or piece of meat represented a life given, a sacrifice that ensured survival. Eating was not only about satisfying hunger, it was about honoring the cycle of life. Across hundreds of tribes, traditions varied, yet this shared understanding remained. Among the Pueblo peoples, corn was more than a crop. It was a gift from Creator, the very foundation of existence. Every kernel carried symbolic power. Among the Plains tribes, the buffalo provided meat, hides, bones, and sinew, and in return, ceremonies of gratitude were performed, sometimes before the animal was even brought back to camp. In the forests of the Northeast, Iroquois held rituals to thank the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, believed to be sisters in spirit who nourish humanity together. The way they viewed food was deeply spiritual, reminding each generation that survival was not only a matter of skill, but also of respect for the balance of nature. Meals were also a social glue. Food was not consumed alone if it could be avoided. It was shared, passed hand to hand, and experienced together. To eat in community meant to strengthen bonds. Around fires, families told stories, taught lessons, and preserved traditions. A child did not just learn to eat. They learned to listen, to observe, to understand the values of their people. The very act of preparing a meal became a kind of classroom, where knowledge of herbs, cooking methods, and food preservation was passed down from elders to the young. These lessons shaped identity as much as they filled the stomach. There was also ceremony in the way food was gathered. When berries were picked, it was common for the first handful to be left behind as an offering to the land. When animals were hunted, prayers or songs might be sung, acknowledging the life that had been taken. Even fishing was done with care, never stripping rivers bare, but ensuring that enough was left for future seasons. In this way, food practices were tied not just to the present but to the future, creating a responsibility for generations yet to come. This sense of responsibility, the sacredness of food, was a cornerstone of their survival. Think of how different this is from our modern relationship with meals. For many today, food is quick, disposable, and often taken without thought. But for Native Americans of the past, every part of a meal carried weight. The preparation was deliberate. The eating was mindful. The memory of the earth's gift was always present. This is why ceremonies involving food were so powerful. They reminded everyone that eating was not a private act. It was a communal act, a spiritual act, a reaffirmation that people and nature were bound together. The sacredness of food also showed in the way meals were tied to rituals of life. Births, marriages, seasonal changes, and harvests were all marked by shared feasts. These gatherings did not just fill the body, they filled the spirit. A communal meal after a successful hunt was more than sustenance. It was thanksgiving, joy, and unity expressed through flavor and nourishment. Every bite of roasted meat or spoon of corn stew was a thread in the larger fabric of tribal life. Even in times of scarcity, when winter bit hard and food was thin, the sacred view of meals did not vanish. If only a little could be shared, it was still shared. The act of dividing food among family members ensured survival of the group, but also symbolized something greater, that no one was left alone and no one was forgotten. In this way, food kept not only bodies alive, but also traditions, values, and hopes. It is remarkable to consider how much knowledge was woven into these practices. Native Americans understood the cycles of plants, the migration of animals, and the rhythm of seasons. They knew which herbs could heal, which roots could be eaten raw, and which berries needed careful preparation. None of this was written down in books. It was remembered in rituals, stories, and the meals prepared day after day. Cooking was not only about survival, it was a way of teaching, of preserving wisdom across centuries. This understanding makes clear that food, for Native Americans, was more than daily necessity. It was spiritual obligation. It was a way of binding people together, binding them to their ancestors, and binding them to the world around them. When they gathered around a fire, the meal was the center, but the meaning extended far beyond the circle of those eating. It reached into the past, recalling ancestors who had eaten the same foods in the same ways, and it reached into the future, ensuring that these traditions would not be forgotten. So when we ask how Native Americans prepared meals without modern tools, we must first understand why those meals mattered. They mattered because they kept people alive, but also because they carried the memory of the earth and the voices of the ancestors. Every meal was a link in the chain of human survival and identity. Without this sacred bond, the food itself would have lost its power. But with it, even the simplest meal, a handful of roasted corn or a piece of smoked fish, became a story of gratitude, resilience, and connection. And so, each time the fire was lit, each time the pot of clay was filled, and each time food was shared among a group, the meal became a reminder. It was a reminder that survival was not only about eating, but about belonging, honoring, and remembering. It was a reminder that food was not simply food. It was life made sacred. The land itself was the first teacher of every native community. Geography did not simply influence what people ate. It dictated how they lived, what they valued, and how they survived. From the frozen north to the desert south, from the wide plains to the dense forests, the natural world presented both opportunities and challenges. Each tribe learned to adapt, crafting food traditions that were as varied as the landscapes themselves. In the icy regions of the far north, survival meant mastering the harshest conditions. The Inuit, who lived in lands where snow and ice stretched for endless miles, had no fertile fields to plant corn or beans. Instead, they turned to the sea. Fish, seals, and whales became the foundation of their diet. These resources were not only hunted, but also preserved with great care. Meat and fish were dried or frozen in the natural cold, stored for long months when hunting became nearly impossible. The cold itself was their storehouse, and knowledge of the sea was their greatest tool. Cooking often meant using open flames within shelters carved of snow or stone, and meals were rich in fat to provide the energy needed to endure the brutal climate. Far to the south, the story looked very different. In the deserts of the southwest, where rainfall was scarce and summers blazed with heat, tribes such as the Hopi and Navajo built entire ways of life around water conservation. They developed ingenious irrigation systems to coax crops from the dry earth. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, formed the backbone of their meals, but how they were grown was just as impressive as how they were cooked. Earthen ovens were dug into the ground, heated with wood until stones glowed, and then used to bake bread or roast vegetables slowly. In a place where resources were limited, nothing was wasted, and meals were prepared with efficiency that mirrored the discipline required to survive the desert itself. Travel eastward into the Great Plains, and the picture changes once again. This was the land of the buffalo, an animal that provided not just food, but nearly everything a tribe needed: meat, hides, bones, and sinew. The Plains tribes became master hunters, following herds that stretched to the horizon. Food here centered on buffalo meat, often roasted or dried into pemmican, a mixture of meat, fat, and berries that could last for months. With wide open spaces, fires burned bright under the sky, and meat was smoked in large quantities to ensure survival through the long winters. Geography shaped not only diet but culture itself, as life revolved around the migration of the herds and the rituals that honored them. The land itself was the first teacher of every native community. Geography did not simply influence what people ate. It dictated how they lived, what they valued, and how they survived. From the frozen north to the desert south, from the wide plains to the dense forests, the natural world presented both opportunities and challenges. Each tribe learned to adapt, crafting food traditions that were as varied as the landscapes themselves. In the icy regions of the far north, survival meant mastering the harshest conditions. The Inuit, who lived in land where snow and ice stretched for endless miles, had no fertile fields to plant corn or beans. Instead, they turned to the sea. Fish, seals, and whales became the foundation of their diet. These resources were not only hunted, but also preserved with great care. Meat and fish were dried or frozen in the natural cold, stored for long months when hunting became nearly impossible. The cold itself was their storehouse, and knowledge of the sea was their greatest tool. Cooking often meant using open flames within shelters carved of snow or stone, and meals were rich in fat to provide the energy needed to endure the brutal climate. Far to the south, the story looked very different. In the deserts of the southwest, where rainfall was scarce and summers blazed with heat, tribes such as the Hopi and Navajo built entire ways of life around water conservation. They developed ingenious irrigation systems to coax crops from the dry earth. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, formed the backbone of their meals, but how they were grown was just as impressive as how they were cooked. Earthen ovens were dug into ground, heated with wood until stones glowed, and then used to bake bread or roast vegetables slowly. In a place where resources were limited, nothing was wasted, and meals were prepared with efficiency that mirrored the discipline required to survive the desert itself. Travel eastward into the Great Plains, and the picture changes once again. This was the land of the buffalo, an animal that provided not just food, but nearly everything a tribe needed: meat, hides, bones, and sinew. The Plains tribes became master hunters, following herds that stretched the horizon. Food here centered on buffalo meat, often roasted or dried into pemmican, a mixture of meat, fat, and berries that could last for months. With wide open spaces, fires burned bright under the sky, and meat was smoked in large quantities to ensure survival through the long winters. Geography shaped not only diet but culture itself. As life revolved around the migration of the herds and the rituals that honored them, in the woodlands of the Northeast, food traditions reflected the bounty of forests, rivers, and fertile soil. Tribes such as Iroquois and Algonquin had access to fish, deer, wild berries, and rich crops. Here, meals were varied, and cooking involved stews simmering in clay pots, corn roasted over open flames, and fish cooked on wooden planks near the fire. The dense forests offered shelter, and rivers offered endless sources of food, creating diets that were balanced and diverse. The Three Sisters crops played a central role, often planted together in fields where corn provided structure, beans climbed tall, and squash spread across the soil. Geography shaped not just the meals, but the farming systems that sustained generations. Farther west, the coastal tribes of California and the Pacific Northwest thrived on salmon runs that returned year after year. Salmon was more than food. It was part of identity. Tribes developed elaborate smoking methods to preserve fish, ensuring it could last well beyond the season. Shellfish, berries, and roots added variety, and cedarwood became both a cooking material and a sacred element of meals. The abundance of the coast created a rhythm of feasts, where food was shared in large gatherings, binding the community together. Here, geography brought both richness and reliability, allowing traditions of hospitality and ceremony to flourish. Each environment required its own solutions, and each solution reflected a deep understanding of the land. The high mountains demanded one way of life, the flat plains another. Even the timing of meals was shaped by geography. In fertile valleys, harvest seasons determined when food was most abundant. In harsher lands, meals were timed by what could be gathered or hunted at the moment. Geography forced tribes to think not just of today, but of tomorrow, teaching them to preserve, to plan, and to respect the cycles of nature. It is striking to consider how much diversity existed across the Americas. A traveler moving from one region to another would have seen completely different cooking practices, ingredients, and traditions, yet each was perfectly suited to the landscape. There was no single way to prepare meals, because there was no single way to live. Adaptation was the key, and every tribe demonstrated an ability to transform the environment's challenges into opportunities for survival and identity. What unites all of these stories is the idea that geography was never seen as an enemy. The land was harsh at times, unforgiving even, but it was always approached with respect. The forests, rivers, deserts, and plains were not obstacles. They were partners in life. Food was the expression of this partnership. The knowledge of which roots could heal, which animals could be hunted, and which crops could grow in dry soil was not just practical, it was sacred. Each bite of food told the story of a people who had listened to the land and answered its demands with wisdom. Today, when we look back at these traditions, we see not only survival but resilience. Native Americans did not merely adapt to geography, they thrived within it. Their meals carried the flavor of the earth they lived upon, and their cooking reflected the landscapes that defined their lives. It is a powerful reminder that geography is more than background. It is the stage upon which history is written, and food is the script that tells its story. And so, when we ask how ancient Native Americans prepared their meals without modern tools, we must also ask where they prepared them. The answer lies in the frozen coasts, the burning deserts, the rolling plains, and the deep forests. Geography shaped every flavor, every method, and every tradition. The land fed them, challenged them, and in turn became part of who they were. Fire was the heart of every meal, the force that transformed raw ingredients into nourishment. For Native Americans, it was more than a tool. It was a living presence, something to be respected, protected, and passed carefully from one day to the next. Without fire, there was no warmth, no protection, and no food. With it, entire communities survived. The story of how ancient Native people prepared their meals is, in many ways, the story of how they tamed fire and made it part of their daily lives. Imagine standing in the deep woods, long before the spark of a match or the strike of a lighter. To create flame required patience and knowledge. Dry wood, carefully chosen, was rubbed or struck against stone. Sparks caught on fibers of bark or dry grass, coaxed gently until smoke rose and finally grew into flame. To watch this was to see skill pass through generations, for not everyone could summon fire from the wilderness. Once it was alive, families treated it as sacred, knowing that letting it die meant hardship, and relighting it might take hours of effort. Once burning, fire became the center of the household. Around it, families gathered for warmth in winter, for light in darkness, and for the meals that kept them alive. Meat roasted over open flames carried the deep flavor of smoke. Corn, tossed directly onto glowing embers, came out toasted and sweet. Fish was placed on wooden stakes near the heat, cooking slowly while its oil sizzled into the flames. In every form, fire shaped the taste and texture of food, making it not only edible but desirable. But fire was more than just a flame. It was an art. Different tribes mastered different ways of using it. In the northeast woodlands, slow-burning fires were kept under clay pots to simmer stews made of corn, beans, and squash. On the Great Plains, large fires smoked strips of buffalo meat hung on wooden racks, drying into food that could last for months. In the deserts of the Southwest, underground ovens were built, where heated stones trapped beneath the earth roasted food for hours, infusing it with the warmth of the soil itself. Fire could be fierce and direct, or subtle and slow. Each technique carried its own meaning, shaped by need and environment. The preservation of food through fire was especially vital. Smoking meat was not just about flavor. It was about survival through winter. By drying and smoking game, families could create stores of food that would not spoil even in harsh conditions. In the north, where cold was constant, smoked fish and dried meat hung in shelters, safe from decay. On the plains, buffalo was cut into thin strips and smoked until it became tough and lasting. This practice turned fire into a safeguard, a promise that hunger could be held at bay when the land grew barren. Even the gathering around the fire carried significance. A flame in the center camp was never just practical, it was communal. Stories were told while food roasted. Elders spoke lessons as smoke curled into the sky. The fire connected people not just to their meals but to each other. It created a space where survival blended with memory, where the act of eating became tied to culture itself. Control of fire was also an act of balance. Too little flame, and food remained raw, unsafe to eat. Too much, and a meal was ruined, precious resources lost. So, great care was taken to tend the fire. Children were taught to feed it with small twigs, to protect it from wind, and to understand how it breathed. This relationship with fire was almost human in nature. It had to be cared for, watched over, and never ignored. Some tribes even held fire in a spiritual light. Among certain communities, fire represented the energy of the sun, a gift brought down to the earth. To eat food cooked by fire was, in a sense, to partake in that sacred energy. Flames became symbols of renewal and continuity, a sign that life itself carried on to the shared act of eating. This sense of reverence is why so many meals began with small gestures of gratitude to the land, to the hunt, and to the fire that made everything possible. It is easy to forget in our modern kitchens how revolutionary fire was. Today, a stove or an oven is so ordinary we hardly notice it. But for Native Americans of the past, fire was an invention rediscovered daily, a miracle tended carefully. It was the single most important factor that turned raw survival into something richer, into culture, tradition, and taste. When we look at the role of fire, we also see the beginnings of human creativity with food. Cooking over flame did not simply make food safe. It created new textures and flavors. Smoke added depth to meat. Roasting brought sweetness from corn. Even vegetables took on new life when touched by heat. These discoveries shaped not only diets but preferences, turning meals into something enjoyed, not merely endured. Fire taught people to experiment, to adapt, and to appreciate food beyond its necessity. The sound of fire, too, played its part in memory. The crackle of wood, the hiss of fat dripping into flame, the rush of sparks into the night sky. These were sounds that marked daily life. They became part of the rhythm of existence, as familiar as the rising sun or the blowing wind. The scent of smoke on clothes, the glow of embers in the dark, the warmth on skin. These were constant companions, reminders that fire was always present, always vital. Fire was the heart of cooking. but it was also the heartbeat of life itself. To control was to claim power over nature, to bend a dangerous force into something sustaining. In that balance of danger and survival, native peoples carved out traditions that lasted for centuries. Every roasted ear of corn, every smoked fish, every meal simmered in a clay pot carried the mark of fire's gift. And so, when we think of how Native Americans prepared meals without modern tools, we must first picture the flame, for it was fire that turned survival into tradition, and it was fire that gave every meal its spirit. Without it, there could be no story of food, no story of community, and no story of survival. Fire was, and always will be, the true heart of the native kitchen. Across the landscapes of early America, from the forests of the Northeast to the deserts of the Southwest, one cooking method stood out for its ingenuity and endurance: the underground oven. Known by many names, it was essentially a pit dug into the ground, lined with heated stones, and covered with earth to trap heat inside. At first glance, it was a simple concept, but in truth, it revealed a deep understanding of fire, heat, and timing. It showed how native people transformed the very earth beneath their feet into a kitchen that could prepare feasts for entire communities. Imagine standing near one of these earth pits. The fire had been burning inside for hours, filling a hole with scorching heat. Once the wood turned to glowing coals and the rocks were heated to their core, the pit was ready. Freshly gathered leaves, often from plants like yucca, corn husks, or grasses, were laid down to form a protective bed. On top of this, food was carefully arranged: meat, fish, root vegetables, maize, and sometimes even seeds or nuts. The food was then covered with more leaves, sealed in with a layer of soil, and left to cook slowly under the earth. Hours later, when the pit was opened, steam burst out, carrying rich, smoky aromas. What emerged was tender, flavorful food, infused with the scent of earth and plants. This method was not only efficient, but also adaptable. In the Southwest, the Pueblo people perfected earth ovens for roasting maize and agave, sometimes cooking them for days until the fibers softened into sweetness. In the Northwest, salmon was sometimes slow-cooked in pits, turning the fish moist and flaky. In the eastern woodlands, roots like wild potatoes and camas bulbs were buried in pits, releasing a caramel-like flavor after long cooking. The technique turned the most stubborn foods into edible treasures. What made earth ovens remarkable was how they combined patience with practicality. Unlike roasting over open flames, which required constant tending, pit cooking allowed communities to prepare food in bulk while freeing their hands for other tasks. A pit could hold enough food to feed dozens of people, making it especially valuable for festivals, ceremonies, or harvest gatherings. While the food cooked underground, people could work, hunt, or take part in rituals, knowing that the earth itself was guarding their meal. Clay also played a central role in native cooking. Long before metal pots and pans, clay vessels were crafted, shaped by hand, and hardened by fire. These pots were used to boil stews, grind corn, or bake bread. Some were made thin and delicate for careful cooking, while others were thick and strong for long simmering. With clay, native peoples discovered the ability to harness water and fire together, creating soups and broths rich with flavor and nutrients. Clay pots also allowed for experimentation, mixing maize with beans, squash, or herbs to produce meals that were filling and nourishing. One striking example of clay use was in the making of ash-baked bread. Dough made from ground corn or wild seeds was placed on hot clay or stone slabs, sometimes covered with ashes, and left to bake slowly. The result was a rustic bread with a smoky crust, eaten fresh or carried on journeys. These breads became symbols of resourcefulness, showing how simple ingredients could be transformed with clay and fire into something lasting. Earth ovens and clay vessels also carried symbolic meaning. They reflected a connection between people and the land. The pit itself came from the earth. The stones were gathered from rivers or mountains. The leaves used as coverings came from plants nearby. Even the soil used to seal the oven was part of the process. Cooking in this way was a reminder that survival came directly from the landscape. Every meal was a partnership with nature, one that required respect and care. The time invested in pit cooking also added to its significance. To prepare an earth oven was not a task done in haste. It was a ritual of gathering, arranging, and waiting. Families came together to dig, to gather fuel, to prepare food. When the oven was sealed, anticipation grew. Opening it hours later was a moment of shared joy, as everyone took part in the feast. This communal aspect gave underground ovens a role far beyond cooking. They were at the heart of togetherness. Some tribes passed down specific knowledge about how to build and manage these ovens. The size of the pit, the type of stone, the order of layering, all were carefully taught. Too much heat could burn food, while too little could leave it raw. The use of leaves not only prevented burning, but also flavored a meal, much like seasoning. These small details show the science of cooking, learned not in written text but through centuries of practice. The endurance of this method is striking. Even today, in parts of North and Central America, similar ovens are used for community feasts. From Hawaiian imu to New Mexican horno ovens, the legacy of earth pit cooking remains alive, showing that some traditions are too practical and too flavorful to disappear. The use of underground ovens also hints at something larger: the ability of native peoples to create sustainable methods that fit their environments. These ovens required no permanent structures, no manufactured tools. They could be built anywhere with nothing but earth, stone, and fire. This flexibility meant that whether in the desert, the forest, or along the coast, people could adapt the same principle to their needs. It was survival made elegant, using what was already present in the landscape. In a world where modern kitchens rely on steel, gas, and electricity, the idea of cooking with nothing but earth and stone may seem distant, yet the results were extraordinary. Tender meat, roasted corn, sweetened roots, all came from a process as old as human memory. These meals carried flavors that were deeply tied to place, a taste of the earth itself. The underground oven tells us something about human creativity. It was not about inventing something entirely new, but about looking at the world differently. Where one person saw soil and rocks, another saw an oven. Where one saw hardship, another saw possibility. Through this vision, Native Americans created a way of cooking that was as practical as it was beautiful. In every pit oven, in every clay pot, we see more than a meal. We see a culture's wisdom, its patience, and its harmony with the natural world. We see the ways people turn necessity into tradition, and tradition into identity. And as the steam rises from the earth, carried with the scent of food and fire, we glimpse the heart of story that continues to echo through time. Across the ancient landscapes of the Americas, one crop rose above all others, not only as food but as a symbol of life itself. That crop was corn, known as maize. For native peoples, maize was more than a grain. It was a gift from the earth, a sacred substance that fed bodies and nourished spirits. Entire civilizations rose and thrived around it, and countless traditions grew from its planting, harvesting, and preparation. When we speak of Native American food, maize is at the center, standing as a reminder of how a single plant could shape a continent's destiny. The journey of corn began thousands of years ago. It was first cultivated in what is now southern Mexico from a wild grass called teosinte. Over centuries, through patient selection and planting, early farmers transformed this tiny, hard-seeded plant into tall, golden stalks we recognize today. By the time European explorers set foot on American soil, maize was already deeply rooted across North and South America. It was grown in fields, in valleys, on mountaintops, and even in arid deserts where little else could survive. But what made maize so important was not only its resilience, but its versatility. Every part of the plant was used. The kernels were eaten fresh or dried, then ground into flour for bread and porridge. Husks became wrappers for cooking, while stalks could feed livestock or even serve as building material. More than food, maize was woven into the rhythm of life, tied to planting ceremonies, harvest festivals, and creation myths. Many tribes believed maize was a direct gift from the Creator, placed into human hands so that life could continue. Preparing maize required both labor and knowledge. Kernels could be eaten raw in times of hunger, but the true richness of corn was unlocked through grinding and cooking. Women often took the lead in this work, rising before dawn to grind corn on stone metates or in mortars. The sound of grinding became part of daily life, echoing across villages like a heartbeat. Ground into coarse meal, maize could be stirred into water to create gruel or shaped into dough for bread. One of the most remarkable techniques developed was nixtamalization, a process discovered long before modern science could explain its value. By soaking dried corn in an alkaline solution made from ash or lime, native peoples unlocked essential nutrients like niacin, making the grain far more nutritious. This knowledge ensured survival, preventing disease and strengthening communities. What seemed like a simple cooking step was, in reality, a brilliant piece of food science handed down through generations. Corn was prepared in endless ways. In the eastern woodlands, it was often boiled into thick stews with beans and squash, forming the famous Three Sisters meal. This trio not only provided balanced nutrition, but also reflected harmony in planting. Corn gave the beans a stalk to climb, while squash shaded the ground, keeping soil moist. Together, they created a system of mutual support, both in the field and on the table. Across the plains, roasted corn became a traveler's staple. Dried and ground into a portable meal known as pinole, it could be mixed with water to sustain warriors and hunters on long journeys. In the Southwest, Pueblo and Hopi peoples created elaborate bread traditions, using ground blue corn baked on hot stones into thin, delicate sheets. These breads were not only food but offerings and ceremonies, symbolizing respect for the earth and ancestors. In the Great Lakes region, hominy, corn treated with lye or ash, was cooked slowly into thick dishes, sometimes with meat or fish. Its chewy texture and rich flavor made it comfort food that carried deep meaning for families. Further south, tamales wrapped in corn husks became festive dishes, made in large batches and shared during communal gatherings. Each variation carried its own story, yet all reflected the same truth. Corn was a thread that bound communities together. The role of corn went beyond the household. It shaped economies, trade, and diplomacy. Tribes often exchanged surplus maize with neighbors, spreading not only the grain itself but the techniques to prepare it. Maize fields became symbols of wealth and stability, and the ability to grow enough corn often determined whether a community thrived or struggled. Ritual dances, songs, and prayers accompanied planting and harvest, showing reverence to the grain that made survival possible. Even in times of conflict, corn remained central. During war, destroying a community's maize fields was a devastating act, as it struck at the heart of survival. Conversely, protecting those fields was an act of defiance and resilience. Stories from history show how communities rebuilt after raids, replanting their corn as a sign that life and tradition would not be erased. When Europeans first encountered maize, they were astonished by its abundance and variety. They carried it back across the Atlantic, where it quickly spread into Europe, Africa, and Asia. Today, corn is one of the world's most widely grown crops, feeding billions of people. But its story began with native peoples who saw not just a plant, but a living companion, one that demanded care and respect. What makes maize remarkable is not only its adaptability, but its endurance. Even now, many native communities continue to honor corn through festivals, planting rituals and traditional dishes. From green corn ceremonies in the Southeast to modern powwows where corn-based foods are shared, the legacy of maize endures. It reminds us that food is never just about filling the stomach. It is about identity, memory, and continuity. The sacred grain of the Americas stands as a symbol of human creativity and resilience. It tells us how people learned to work with the land, how they transformed a fragile wild grass into a pillar of survival, and how they built cultures around its gifts. Corn was not a luxury. It was life itself. To this day, every kernel carries with it centuries of wisdom, hard work, and faith. As we picture those early kitchens without walls, without iron pots or modern stoves, we can still hear the grinding stones, see the steam rising from clay pots, and feel the importance of maize in every meal. It was food, but it was also a story of patience, of innovation, and of gratitude. And in every story of corn, we find not just the past of native peoples, but the roots of our own global table today. For native peoples across the Americas, hunting was never just about food. It was a test of skill, courage, and respect for the natural world. From the icy plains where bison roamed in endless herds to the dense forests where deer moved silently through shadows, animals provided more than meat. They provided survival. But hunting was only the first step. The real challenge was ensuring that the bounty of the hunt could last far beyond the moment it was caught. Without refrigerators, iceboxes, or any modern tools, native communities mastered the art of preservation. turning perishable meat into stores that could carry them through long winters, migrations, and times of scarcity. When a deer, elk, or bison was taken, the process was carried out with remarkable precision. Nothing was wasted. The hide became clothing or shelter, the bones, tools, and weapons, the sinews, threads for sewing, and the meat nourishment for the entire community. This deep respect for the animal was reflected in rituals and prayers, acts that acknowledged the sacrifice of life so others could live. Such traditions remind us that food was always more than survival. It was a sacred exchange. Once meat was harvested, it had to be preserved quickly. One of the oldest and most effective methods was drying. Strips of meat were sliced thin and laid out under the sun or hung above a low fire. The wind and heat drew out moisture, transforming fresh meat into tough, dry strips that could last for months. This dried meat was light, easy to carry, and ready to be eaten in times of need. Across the plains, it became the foundation for pemmican, a powerful survival food made by pounding dried meat into powder, mixing it with rendered fat, and sometimes adding berries. Packed with energy and nutrients, pemmican could sustain hunters, travelers, and even entire families through harsh winters. Smoking was another essential technique. In the northeast woodlands, fish and venison were hung inside wooden structures where slow-burning fires filled the air with smoke. The smoke not only dried the meat but also coated it with natural preservatives, adding flavor while keeping insects and rot at bay. Some communities built large smoking racks, capable of holding dozens of cuts of meat at once, a communal effort that ensured no food was lost. The aroma of smoking meat became a familiar part of daily life, drifting through villages and marking the rhythm of survival. In colder regions, the climate itself became an ally. On the frozen plains and in the Arctic, meat could be buried in snow or ice, preserved naturally by the environment. The Inuit, for example, developed methods of storing seal or fish under layers of frozen ground, allowing them to draw upon these reserves when hunting conditions grew difficult. What might seem harsh or unlivable to outsiders was, to native peoples, a system of adaptation where the earth itself became a storage chamber. Salt, while not always abundant, was sometimes used in regions where it could be gathered from lakes or deposits. In such places, rubbing meat with salt crystals created another layer of preservation, one that kept food safe for longer journeys. But for most native tribes, smoke, drying, and cold were the trusted guardians of their harvest. Preservation was not only about survival, it shaped culture and trade. Dried and smoked meats could be stored for months, meaning that food could travel with migrating bands or be exchanged with neighboring tribes. A surplus of preserved food became a source of strength, ensuring that even during drought, failed hunts, or seasonal scarcity, there was something to eat. It also meant that hunters could range farther, knowing they carried supplies that would not spoil. The process of preserving meat also brought people together. It was often communal work, with men hunting and women preparing the cuts, building fires, and watching over the drying racks. Children learned by observing, taking part in simple tasks, and absorbing knowledge that would be vital for their own survival one day. In these moments, preservation was more than food storage. It was the transfer of tradition. Different tribes developed unique variations based on their environment. In the Great Plains, bison was preserved in massive quantities, sustaining large groups through winter storms. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon was a lifeblood of preservation, with families smoking hundreds of fish each season to ensure survival. In the Southwest, rabbits and smaller game were dried in the arid heat, their meat ground into powders and mixed with maize for long-lasting meals. Each region's method reflected the landscape's gifts and limitations, turning necessity into art. There was also wisdom and balance. While preservation kept communities safe, fresh meat was always valued. Feasts followed successful hunts, where the choicest cuts were roasted and shared. What could not be eaten was preserved, creating a cycle of abundance and security. These feasts often carried symbolic meaning, reinforcing bond between families and tribes, reminding all that food was not to be hoarded but shared. Looking deeper, the preservation of meat also represented resilience against uncertainty. Nature was unpredictable. Winters could be longer than expected, herds could migrate away, rivers could freeze, or drought could strike. By mastering preservation, native peoples built a buffer against these uncertainties, ensuring that their survival did not depend solely on the hunt of tomorrow. It was foresight, born from generations of experience, that made the difference between hunger and strength. When outsiders later encountered these methods, they were often astonished. European settlers, struggling to adapt to the vast and unfamiliar land, learned from native peoples how to dry, smoke, and store food. These techniques became essential for survival on frontiers where modern conveniences were non-existent. In this way, native traditions not only sustained their own communities, but also influenced the survival strategies of others. Today, echoes of these practices still remain. Smoked salmon is celebrated worldwide. Jerky fills shelves in every store, and slow-smoked barbecue has become a culinary art. Yet behind these modern foods lies a story much older, the story of how Native Americans, with no modern tools, turned raw nature into nourishment that can endure. The art of preservation tells us something profound about human ingenuity. It reveals how people, faced with the challenges of survival, created systems that were not wasteful but sustainable. It shows how every animal taken was honored by using every part, ensuring nothing was discarded. And it reminds us that preservation was not simply a skill but a philosophy, one that respected life, valued foresight, and placed community above the individual. As we imagine those ancient scenes, meat strips swaying above smoky fires, families working side by side, hunters returning with game, while children watch with eager eyes, we glimpse a way of life built on harmony with the environment. It was a life where food was not guaranteed, but through wisdom and patience, it was secured. And in that balance between hunger and plenty, Native Americans carve out a legacy of resilience, one preserved not just in dried meat or smoked fish, but an enduring memory of survival itself. Imagine a world without the luxury of sugar bowls, salt shakers, or shelves lined with jars of spices imported from faraway lands. For Native Americans, flavoring food did not depend on these modern comforts, but rather on what the land and environment could naturally provide. Cooking was not only about survival, it was about crafting meals that nourished the body and pleased the senses. To achieve this, tribes across the continent turned to a wide range of natural flavorings, each tied deeply to their geography, climate, and cultural traditions. These ingredients were often foraged with care, grown with skill, or harvested with respect. And together they reveal an entirely different way of thinking about taste. Wild herbs were among the most important sources of flavor. Depending on the region, different plants were prized for their aromatic qualities. In the Northeast, tribes like the Iroquois used wild onions and garlic, not only to season food, but also for their healing properties. Further west, sage became a central herb used by Plains and Southwestern tribes for both cooking and ceremony. Its sharp, earthy taste added depth to roasted meats and stews. Mint, too, was gathered from riversides and meadows, its refreshing leaves steeped into teas or crushed into food for a bright contrast. Every herb carried more than flavor. It carried memory, ritual, and connection to the land. Roots and barks also found their place in native kitchens. Sassafras, for instance, was valued in the Southeast. Its leaves were dried and ground into a powder, famously becoming the thickener and flavoring base for what would later evolve into gumbo in Louisiana cuisine. Birch bark, on the other hand, could be boiled to make teas or used to impart a slightly sweet, wintergreen note to drinks and broths. Even the humble cattail root, when roasted, gave off a nutty taste that could enhance an otherwise plain dish. These earthy seasonings were not added at random. They reflected generations of knowledge about how plants could be transformed into something both useful and flavorful. Fruits played a crucial role, not only in nutrition, but in flavoring meals. Blueberries, cranberries, chokecherries, and elderberries were treasured across different regions. They were often dried in the sun and stored for later use, allowing tribes to flavor stews, breads, or pemmican with bursts of sweet and tart. Cranberries in particular were known for balancing rich meats, while chokecherries could be mixed into doughs for a tangy taste. In many tribes, berries were not seen as ordinary additions but as seasonal treasures, linked to cycles of growth and renewal. One cannot talk about natural flavorings without mentioning maple. Among tribes of the Northeast and Great Lakes, maple sap was collected in late winter and early spring. Boiled down slowly over a fire, it transformed into a syrup or crystallized sugar, offering a sweetness that was rare and precious. Maple was more than just a sweetener. It flavored cornmeal porridge, coated roasted meats, and was used in ceremonies celebrating the arrival of spring. The effort it took to tap trees, collect sap, and tend fires for hours showed how deeply communities valued its taste. Seeds and nuts also became flavor enhancers in surprising ways. Sunflower seeds, ground into pastes or oils, gave food a rich, nutty profile. Hazelnuts and walnuts, cracked open with stones, could be roasted or pressed, their oils serving as both cooking fat and seasoning. Pine nuts, common in the diets of southwestern tribes, carried a buttery quality that paired well with roasted vegetables and wild grains. These ingredients not only enriched meals, but also provided a source of healthy fats, a critical resource in times when food could be scarce. Chilies and peppers deserve special attention. In the Southwest and parts of Mesoamerica, chili peppers were cultivated long before European contact. Their fiery heat transformed simple corn, beans, or game into dishes full of complexity. Some peppers were dried and ground into powders, while others were roasted over flames to deepen their smoky taste. These peppers were more than flavor. They were identity. Their presence in stews and sauces tied people to the earth, the sun, and centuries of agricultural knowledge. Even today, the flavor traditions of native chili use remain alive in southwestern cuisine. Another fascinating example of natural flavoring came from smoked woods. Just as today we use hickory or mesquite to smoke meat, native tribes understood how different woods imparted different tastes. Hickory added a strong, bold character, while alderwood gave off a softer, sweeter smoke. Smoking was not just preservation, it was seasoning. The smoke penetrated fish, venison, or turkey, giving meals depth and aroma that could not be achieved in any other way. Some flavorings carried spiritual or symbolic importance. Sweetgrass, for instance, was sometimes used to flavor teas, though it was more often burned in ceremonies. Its sweet, vanilla-like scent was said to purify and calm. Cedar could be infused in small amounts to flavor drinks or stews, linking everyday nourishment with sacred traditions. To many native peoples, flavor was not separated from meaning. What was eaten was part of a larger story about balance, respect, and gratitude. What makes all of this even more remarkable is the ingenuity with which these flavorings were combined. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were often cooked together not only for nutrition, but because their flavors complemented one another. A stew of venison might be enriched with wild garlic, balanced with cranberries, and sweetened with a hint of maple sugar. Each meal was a careful layering of taste, built from the landscape itself. Looking closely at these traditions, one can see how Native Americans turned necessity into art. They did not simply eat to fill their stomachs. They ate with intention, drawing flavor from roots, leaves, berries, seeds, and smoke. Their kitchens may not have resembled ours, but their knowledge of taste was profound. These natural flavorings reveal a culture where food was medicine, story, and heritage, all wrapped into one. And perhaps most striking of all is how these practices echo through time, influencing modern American cuisine in ways we often forget. Cooking was not only about fire and tools, it was also about time. The methods Native Americans used to preserve food were not simply practical solutions for survival. They were the very backbone of their food culture. Without preservation, a hunt's reward might spoil in a matter of days, and a harvest bounty could never last through winter. This necessity gave rise to techniques that were clever, resourceful, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the seasons. Each method, whether drying, smoking, fermenting, or storing, carried its own story and left its mark on how communities lived and thrived. Drying was perhaps the most widespread technique. The sun itself was a powerful tool, and native peoples knew how to use it well. Strips of venison or buffalo were sliced thin and hung across wooden racks in open air, where the sun and breeze would slowly pull out the moisture. This process not only kept meat from rotting, but also made it lighter and easier to carry. Hunters traveling across long distances often relied on dried meat, which would be eaten as it was or softened later in stews. The same practice applied to fish. Along rivers and coastlines, salmon, trout, and cod were split open, salted with naturally found minerals, and left to dry until they became durable sources of protein. Grains and vegetables also found new life through drying. Corn kernels were spread out in baskets or on flat stones, transforming them into golden beads that could be ground into flour even months later. Smoking added another dimension. Beyond preservation, it gave food a distinct taste that became part of tribal identity. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon was not only dried, but also smoked over alderwood fires, the smoke seeping into the flesh and leaving behind a flavor both rich and lasting. On the plains, strips of bison were smoked in low huts where the smoldering would keep flies away while slowly curing the meat. Smoking extended shelf life, but also turned food into something memorable. It tied meals to place, since different woods produced different tastes, linking food to the forests and valleys from which they came. Another practice that reveals the ingenuity of native food traditions was fermenting. Some tribes used fermentation to preserve vegetables or to create beverages. For instance, in certain areas, berries were left to ferment into lightly alcoholic drinks, which carried cultural and sometimes ceremonial significance. Corn, too, could be soaked and softened in a process that broke it down, making it last longer and easier to digest. Fermentation was subtle and required patience, but it showed an advanced understanding of how natural processes could be used for human benefit. Pemmican was a masterpiece of preservation. Developed by the Plains tribes, it combined dried, powdered meat with melted fat, and often dried berries. Packed tightly into containers, it could last for months, even years. Pemmican was dense, portable, and nutritious, providing everything needed for energy and survival. Traders, explorers, and settlers would later adopt this native innovation, relying on it for long journeys. But for the native peoples themselves, it was more than a food. It was a symbol of adaptation to an environment where resources had to be stretched wisely. Storage methods were equally important. Clay pots, woven baskets, and animal hide pouches were used to protect dried foods from moisture and pests. In colder climates, pits were dug into ground and lined with grass, bark, or stones, turning the earth itself into a natural refrigerator. In the Southwest, where corn was grown in abundance, storage rooms were built within pueblos, keeping kernels dry and safe for lean times. These spaces were not mere stockpiles. They represented security, foresight, and the assurance that a community could endure hard seasons. Salt, when available, became a crucial partner in preservation. In regions near salt springs or deposits, native peoples harvested it and sprinkled it onto meat or fish to extend shelf life. In other places where salt was scarce, drying and smoking had to take the lead. This scarcity of salt highlights the creativity of native food systems. Wherever nature limited them, they found another way. Winter was the ultimate test of preservation skills. Without fresh crops or constant hunting, families survived on what they had put away. Imagine a long, cold night in a snow-covered lodge where a pot of stew simmered over the fire. Into the pot went dried corn, pieces of smoked venison, and perhaps a handful of stored beans. What could have spoiled in a week had been transformed into meals that carried entire villages through months of ice and silence. Preservation was not just about keeping food. It was about keeping hope alive. Trade also played a role in spreading preservation techniques. Tribes who specialized in drying or smoking certain foods often exchanged them with others. Salmon from the Northwest could make its way inland, while pemmican traveled vast distances across the plains. Preservation did not only sustain one community, it connected many, weaving a network of shared survival strategies. What stands out most is how preservation shaped daily life. It required planning, labor, and collective effort. Women and men worked together to prepare, slice, hang, and store food, knowing that mistakes could mean hunger later. Children learned early how to gather berries for drying or to help grind corn for storage. These practices were not just chores. They were lessons in patience, responsibility, and respect for the resources nature provided. Looking back today, it is clear that native preservation methods were as ingenious as they were essential. They reveal a deep understanding of natural cycles, from the heat of the sun to the cold of the earth. They also remind us that food was never just a quick meal, but a chain of knowledge passed through generations. Every dried berry, every smoked fish, and every carefully packed bag of pemmican carried centuries of wisdom. It is easy to forget in our modern world of refrigerators and canned goods that people once relied on little more than air, fire, and time to secure their survival. For Native Americans, these methods were not primitive. They were powerful. They turned nature into an ally, ensuring that no season, no matter how harsh, could fully break the human spirit. And even today, echoes of these practices survive in smoked salmon on a dinner table, in jerky carried on a hike, or in a cornmeal that flavors so many dishes. Preservation was and remains a bridge between necessity and tradition, one that still whispers stories of resilience to those willing to listen. The earth itself became a kitchen for native peoples, a place where fire, stone, and soil worked together to turn raw food into meals that could feed entire communities. One of the most remarkable traditions was the underground oven, also known as earth cooking or pit roasting. This method required patience, planning, and cooperation, but the results were unforgettable. Meals that were tender, flavorful, and infused with the very essence of the land. What seems today like a simple hole in the ground was, in reality, a carefully engineered technique passed down through generations. The process began with choosing the right location. A flat area was preferred, often near a settlement or a gathering spot, because earth ovens were rarely used for small, everyday meals. They were most often prepared for feasts, ceremonies, or when large amounts of food needed to be cooked at once. The pit was dug deep enough to hold hot stones and layers of food, and wide enough to accommodate the size of the meal. Some were just a few feet across, while others could be large enough to feed an entire tribe. Once the pit was ready, the real work began. Stones were gathered, carefully selected for their ability to withstand heat without cracking. These stones were heated in a roaring fire until they glowed, holding within the energy of the flames. This step could take hours, and it was often accompanied by songs, stories, and anticipation. The fire was not only a tool, it was a part of the ceremony, a living force that transformed the pit into an oven. When the stones were ready, they were arranged at the bottom of the pit, glowing with heat. Layers of green vegetation, often leaves or grasses, were placed over the stones to create steam and prevent the food from burning. Corn husks, seaweed, or other plants native to the region were used, depending on the environment. This layer served as both insulation and seasoning, infusing the food with subtle flavors from the earth itself. The food came next, and here the variety was astounding. Whole animals, deer, rabbits, turkeys, or fish, could be placed in the pit, sometimes wrapped in leaves or hides. Alongside them went corn, squash, beans, and roots like wild potatoes or camas bulbs. Berries might be added, not just as a sweet touch, but to mix with meats in ways that created balance and nourishment. Everything was arranged carefully, often in multiple layers, to ensure even cooking. More greenery was piled on top of food, and sometimes woven mats or hides were added to trap the steam. Finally, the entire pit was sealed with earth. What had been an open hole became a mound of soil, with heat and steam trapped inside. From that moment, time and patience were the only ingredients left. The food might cook for hours, sometimes even overnight, as the slow, steady heat worked its magic. When the pit was finally opened, the moment was filled with excitement. The smell of roasted meat and vegetables rising from the earth must have been unforgettable. Families and communities gathered to share the meal, often as part of a larger celebration. Food cooked in this way was tender and richly flavored, far different from the quick methods of roasting over open flames. It was a feast not just for the body but for the spirit, created by earth, fire, and human hands working together. This method of cooking was not unique to one tribe or region. Across the Americas, variations of earth ovens were practiced. In the Southwest, Pueblo peoples baked bread in earthen pits lined with hot stones. On the Pacific coast, fish and shellfish were steamed beneath layers of seaweed, capturing the taste of the ocean. In the Northeast, deer and corn were roasted in underground ovens during seasonal gatherings. Even in the far north, where resources were scarce, earth pits were used to preserve warmth and cook meat slowly in frozen landscapes. Each version was adapted to local resources, but the principle remained the same, harnessing the steady, even heat of the earth to prepare food. What is striking is how this practice connected people to the land in the most literal way. The soil was not just a place to plant crops or build homes. It was a partner in the act of nourishment. Digging into the earth to prepare a meal symbolized trust in nature's ability to sustain life. Every layer, from the heated stones to the greenery, was a reminder of how closely tied people were to their surroundings. The underground oven also held social meaning. Because of the time and effort required, it was rarely used for solitary meals. It was communal by nature, bringing people together in cooperation. Men often hunted the game, women gathered plants and prepared the vegetables, and children learned by helping at every stage. By the time the food was ready, the entire community had taken part, and the meal became a shared achievement. Today, echoes of these ancient ovens still survive. In Hawaii, the imu is used in traditional luau's, where pork and vegetables are slow-cooked beneath the ground. In parts of the American Southwest, similar earth cooking practices are remembered during cultural festivals. Even modern techniques, like barbecue smoking and slow roasting, reflect the same idea of patience, low heat, and natural flavor. The underground oven may seem distant in time, but its legacy continues to influence how people cook and celebrate food today. When we imagine those long nights, waiting for the earth to yield its meal, we catch a glimpse of the patience and wisdom of native communities. They understood that food was not meant to be rushed, that nourishment came not only from eating, but from the process of gathering, preparing, and waiting together. It was a lesson in respect for the earth, for fire, and for each other. The underground oven was more than a cooking method. It was a symbol of connection, a way of turning the simplest of tools into a feast that could unite an entire community. Even now, when modern kitchens allow meals to be prepared in minutes, the memory of these ancient ovens reminds us of the power of slowness, of cooperation, and of letting the earth itself play its part in the story of survival. ChatGPT said, "Food in Native American life was never just fuel for the body. It was also a prayer, a celebration, and an expression of gratitude. When communities came together for important moments, whether to honor a successful hunt, mark a seasonal change, or carry out sacred ceremonies, the meal itself became a central part of the ritual. These were not ordinary dinners. They were communal feasts where food was shared as a gift, where every ingredient carried meaning, and where eating together reaffirmed bonds that held people close. Imagine a large open space at the heart of a village. Families gather, fires glow in the evening air, and the smell of roasted meat, corn, and herbs drifts across the settlement. Laughter, song, and the beat of drums mix with the crackle of firewood. These were the moments when food was more than survival. It became part of a living tradition, one that united generations. Many tribes saw ceremonial meals as a way to honor the spirits that provided food. Before the first bite was taken, it was common for a small portion of food to be set aside and offered back to the earth or the fire. This gesture symbolized respect and recognition that nothing in life came without cost. The hunt that brought down a deer, the hands that harvested corn, the fire that cooked the meal, all of it was sacred. By sharing food with the unseen world, people believed they invited blessings for the seasons to come. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, often played an important role in such meals. These crops were more than agricultural staples. They were symbols of balance and harmony. Grown together in fields, each supported the other. Corn stood tall, beans climbed the stalks, and squash covered the soil to keep it moist. When cooked and eaten together during feasts, they carried that same lesson of interdependence. Eating them was a reminder that life flourishes when balance is respected. Meat, too, held ceremonial value. A successful buffalo hunt on the Great Plains did not end with the hunt itself. After days of preparation, drying, smoking, and dividing portions, tribes held great feasts. The meat was shared among families, and no one was left hungry. These gatherings were as much about fairness and generosity as they were about eating. Any Arctic seal or whale feast followed a similar spirit, binding small, tight-knit communities together in gratitude for life in such unforgiving environments. Some ceremonies placed food at the very heart of their meaning. The Green Corn Festival, practiced among tribes in the Southeast, was one such event. This ceremony, which celebrated the ripening of corn, included days of ritual cleansing, fasting, and finally, a communal feast. Corn dishes were served not only to celebrate the harvest, but also to symbolize renewal. By eating together, people marked the cycle of seasons and their ongoing connection to the earth's gifts. Feasts were also about teaching. Elders told stories as meals were shared, passing on lessons of history, morality, and survival. Around a feast fire, children learned not just to eat, but to listen, to remember, and to respect. The food itself became a tool for education, a reminder that survival depended on both knowledge and community. It is important to see how these meals reflected values. Sharing food was never optional. It was expected. A hunter could not keep all of his catch, nor could a farmer keep all of his harvest. To hoard food was to break trust with the community. Instead, meals celebrated abundance through generosity. The act of giving freely strengthened bonds and created a safety net that ensured no one starved in times of scarcity. The atmosphere of such gatherings was rich with emotion. Music often accompanied the meal, from steady drum beats to chants that rose into the night sky. Dances followed, with movements that told stories of creation, of animals, of triumphs, and of struggles. Food provided the strength for the body, while ceremony provided strength for the spirit. Together, they created moments of balance, moments that reinforced the idea that every meal was part of something larger than life itself. Even the preparation of food for these occasions carried ceremonial weight. Women who prepared corn or ground seeds often sang as they worked, weaving prayers into the rhythm of daily labor. Men who hunted or fished carried the responsibility of ensuring that the animal spirit was honored. The process itself was sacred long before the feast began. These traditions also served to unite not only one village, but sometimes multiple groups. Ceremonial meals were often occasions for tribes to meet, trade, and forge alliances. Food became a bridge between people, transforming strangers into guests and guests into partners. A shared meal could settle disputes, create bonds of friendship, or mark the beginning of cooperation. In today's world, echoes of these ceremonial feasts still remain. Powwows, tribal gatherings, and cultural festivals often feature communal meals that honor these traditions. Corn soups, fried bread, roasted meats, and berry dishes are served not just as food, but as reminders of heritage. They are living symbols of a past, where every meal was sacred and every gathering a lesson in gratitude. What is most striking is the way food, in these settings, went far beyond taste or nutrition. It became a thread that tied people to one another and to the land itself. Every bite carried the memory of work, the echo of song, the warmth of community, and the weight of gratitude. For Native peoples, ceremonial meals were acts of storytelling without words, where every dish told survival, respect, and belonging. When we think of these feasts today, we can imagine more than just the smell of roasted corn or the flavor of smoked meat. We can imagine the voices of elders sharing wisdom, the laughter of children, the steady beat of drums, and the glow of firelight on faces gathered in a circle. These were the meals that nourished not only the body but also the soul, meals that carried meaning far beyond the plate. Such traditions remind us that food has always been more than something to eat. It has been a gift, a bond, a symbol, and a promise. For Native Americans, ceremonial meals were a way to keep life in balance, to honor the past, and to build hope for the future. And in many ways, they continue to be exactly that today. Imagine cooking without the shells of spices we rely on today. No pepper, no sugar, no cinnamon or chili flakes waiting in jars. For ancient Native Americans, flavor was drawn from the land itself, shaped by fire, smoke, and the plants that grew nearby. The meals they created did not need exotic spices shipped from across oceans. Instead, they mastered the art of using what was at hand. Fresh herbs, wild greens, tree bark, roots, smoke, and even the soil's minerals, to create dishes that were rich, satisfying, and deeply connected to places they lived. The absence of modern seasoning did not mean the food was bland. It meant creativity was required. Fire was the first and most powerful flavor maker. Roasting meat over open flames, burying roots in embers, or smoking fish for hours all transformed simple ingredients into complex meals. The char from wood, the deep sweetness that came from slow roasting, and the subtle bitterness of smoke created a natural seasoning that was both unique and unforgettable. Even today, many people love the taste of grilled or smoked food. That appreciation is a direct echo of what native cooks perfected centuries ago. Herbs were another key source of flavor. Tribes across the Americas gathered wild plants not only for healing, but also for seasoning their meals. In the Great Plains, wild onions and garlic were used to add sharpness to soups and stews. In the Northeast, herbs like sage, mint, and sweetgrass found their way into food, sometimes mixed with berries or meat to create a refreshing contrast. The Southwest, with its dry landscapes, offered desert herbs and chilies, which later became famous worldwide. These plants, often overlooked today, gave meals both taste and meaning. They were tied to the seasons, gathered fresh, and sometimes reserved for ceremonies. Berries played a surprising role in flavoring food. Blueberries, cranberries, chokecherries, and elderberries were not just eaten raw, but mixed into sauces, pounded with meat, or dried and added to stews. Their natural tartness balanced the richness of fat and meat, much like we use lemon or vinegar today. Cranberries, for example, were often boiled down into a tart paste, creating a seasoning that made hearty meals lighter and easier to enjoy. These fruits brought brightness to the table, turning preservation and nutrition into something enjoyable. Smoke, perhaps more than anything else, defined the taste of native cooking. It carried into meat, fish, and even vegetables. Different woods added different flavors. Alderwood created a sweet, delicate taste, while hickory or mesquite left stronger, bolder notes. Smoke was more than preservative. It was a seasoning in its own right, one that made food distinctive to its region. When people ate smoked salmon on the Pacific coast or smoked venison on the plains, they were tasting not just the animal but the very forest around them. Minerals from the land also provided seasoning. In some regions, natural salt deposits were collected and used to preserve or flavor food. Where salt was rare, ash from certain plants was mixed into meals, giving both taste and added nutrition. This practice, though strange to modern ears, was a creative way to make food healthier while deepening its flavor. The earth itself offered subtle seasonings, reminding us of how resourceful native cooks were in every aspect. The balance of flavors was often tied to balance in life. Sweetness from berries, earthiness from roots, and smokiness from fire all came together in dishes that were not only filling but harmonious. Nothing was wasted. Fat from hunted animals was rendered into cooking oil, giving both richness and energy. Bones were boiled into broths, releasing minerals and flavor that seasoned everything from soups to stews. Even the marrow was prized, eaten directly or stirred into dishes for depth. These choices show a way of cooking where every part of nature was respected and every taste had its place. Meals also reflected the seasons. In spring, fresh greens and wild herbs added bright flavors after the long winter. Summer brought berries, fresh corn, and roasted vegetables. Autumn feasts celebrated abundance, with smoked meats and hearty stews seasoned by roots and herbs. Winter meals leaned on preserved foods, where smoke and drying gave flavor to dishes that kept people alive. Eating was never separate from the time of year. It was always tied to the cycles of nature, and the taste of food reminded people of where they were in that cycle. This creativity, without spices, also shaped the cultural meaning of food. Cooking methods and flavors became part of tribal identity. A person from the Pacific Northwest could taste salmon smoked over alderwood and know instantly where it came from. A person from the Southwest could taste roasted corn mixed with chilies and recognize it as their heritage. Flavors carried memories. They marked the land, the people, and the traditions that kept them alive. In ceremonies, flavor took on symbolic weight. Sweet dishes, often made with berries or corn, represented life's blessings. Bitter herbs reminded people of challenges and endurance. Smoky flavors symbolized transformation, the way raw ingredients became something new. Each taste was more than sensation. It was meaning, woven into rituals that carried wisdom forward. Even today, the influence of these practices continues. The use of cranberries in holiday meals, the popularity of smoked meats, and the growing appreciation for wild herbs all trace back to native traditions. What we think of as modern tastes often come from these ancient roots. They remind us that flavor does not have to come from a jar of spice, but can be drawn from nature itself, if we know how to listen and learn. Cooking without spices may sound limiting to us now, but for Native Americans, it was never a weakness. It was a challenge that sparked creativity, a chance to use fire, plants, and the land itself to season meals. In every bite, they tasted their world, forests, rivers, plains, and deserts, all captured in simple, powerful flavors. And in doing so, they created not just food, but a cuisine that told stories of survival, respect, and connection to the earth. In the world of Native American cooking, the role of women was far greater than simply preparing meals. Women were the guardians of tradition, the keepers of recipes, and the link between food and community survival. Long before cookbooks or written records, knowledge was passed from one generation to the next through memory, practice, and story. Mothers taught daughters how to gather roots in the right season, how to roast corn until it was sweet and golden, and how to preserve berries to last through the coldest winters. Each dish carried not just flavor, but also heritage and identity, and women were at the center of it all. Food was more than nourishment. It was survival, and women carried the responsibility of ensuring their families and tribes never went hungry. The act of grinding corn into flour, pounding dried meat with berries into pemmican, or carefully tending fires for roasting was not just daily work. It was a kind of guardianship. Every step in preparing a meal reflected planning, foresight, and care. Women understood the seasons and cycles of the land, knowing when wild herbs were at their peak, when game would be plentiful, and when stores needed to be built for the hard months ahead. Without their knowledge and labor, life in often harsh environments would have been impossible. The tasks were not done in isolation. Food preparation was a social and cultural act. Women gathered together to cook, talk, and teach. In these moments, traditions were reinforced. Songs, prayers, and rituals often accompanied food making. When corn was ground, for example, it was not unusual for women to sing, their rhythm matching the steady sound of stone against grain. These songs did more than pass the time. They honored the food itself, reminding everyone that eating was a gift and not to be taken for granted. Food also became a tool of teaching values. Girls and young women learned patience by waiting for fires to burn down to the right embers. They learned respect by using every part of an animal and wasting nothing. They learned creativity by making meals from whatever the land offered, turning scarcity into sustenance. In this way, cooking was not only about feeding bodies, but also about shaping character and passing on the values of resilience, gratitude, and respect for nature. The influence of women extended beyond the home. In many tribes, women controlled the planting and harvesting of crops. Corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, were grown under their care. These crops were more than just food. They were part of a spiritual and cultural system that linked people to the earth and to one another. Women decided when seeds would be planted, when they would be harvested, and how they would be stored. This authority over food production gave women significant influence in community life. They were not just cooks, but agricultural leaders and providers. Food in Native societies often held ceremonial importance, and women prepared meals for rituals, feasts, and sacred gatherings. These occasions required more than simple cooking. They required skill, attention, and an understanding of spiritual meaning. Cornmeal might be sprinkled in a prayer, berries offered to honor ancestors, or a stew made to celebrate a harvest. Women ensured that these meals were prepared properly, not only feeding people, but also fulfilling spiritual duties. Food became a bridge between the physical and the sacred, and women were the ones who maintained that bridge. Preservation of food was another area where women's expertise was vital. Drying, smoking, fermenting, and storing required skill and foresight. A mistake could mean spoilage, waste, or hunger in winter. Women mastered these methods, creating supplies that could last months. Dried corn, smoked fish, jerky, and dried berries were staples that sustained entire communities when the land grew quiet in winter. These techniques not only ensured survival, but also reflected a deep understanding of balance, knowing when to use resources and when to save them. The daily work of women in cooking and food preparation shaped identity in powerful ways. Food was not just what people ate, but who they were. For example, in the Northeast, corn was more than a crop. It was considered a sacred gift, and the women who tended it were seen as carrying a sacred duty. In the Southwest, where chili and corn-shaped cuisine, women's cooking reflected both the environment and the culture's resilience. On the plains, women's preparation of bison meat and pemmican was central to the survival of nomadic communities. Everywhere, food and women's roles were intertwined with cultural survival. Over time, this knowledge became part of oral tradition. Recipes were not written down, but they were remembered in hands, eyes, and taste. A daughter could watch her mother prepare a dish hundreds of times before being trusted to do it herself. Measurements were not in cups or spoons, but in handfuls, pinches, and instinct. This way of cooking preserved flexibility, allowing food to adapt to what was available in a given season. It also ensured that meals remained connected to the land and the moment, never becoming rigid or mechanical. Even when new foods were introduced, such as through trade with Europeans, it was women who decided how to integrate them into traditional diets. Wheat flour, sugar, and iron pots slowly became part of native kitchens, but women blended them with older practices. They adapted without forgetting, creating a continuity that preserved cultural identity despite change. This adaptability kept traditions alive even in times of great disruption. What makes the role of women so striking is how invisible it can appear from the outside. Hunting and warfare often dominate stories of native life, but the quiet, steady work of women in kitchens, fields, and around fires held equal, if not greater, importance. Without them, there would have been no stored food for journeys, no meals for ceremonies, and no preserved traditions passed to the next generation. Their work was less celebrated, but absolutely essential. Today, Native communities still honor these traditions. Elders share old recipes. Women teach younger generations to plant, cook, and preserve, and food continues to carry culture forward. In every pot of corn soup, every smoked salmon, and every berry dish, you can still see the fingerprints of the women who preserved not only food, but an entire way of life. Their influence reminds us that cooking is never just about eating. It is about connection, survival, and identity. When European settlers first came into contact with Native American communities, they encountered ways of cooking that were unlike anything they had known before. At first, the differences were striking. Settlers were used to kitchens with heavy iron pots, ovens built into stone fireplaces, and bread made from wheat. In contrast, Native people were roasting corn over open flames, smoking fish on wooden racks, steaming shellfish in earthen pits, and boiling stews using nothing more than heated stones placed inside animal hide containers. What seemed unusual to the settlers was, in reality, the product of centuries of adaptation, resourcefulness, and cultural wisdom. This meeting of traditions created more than simple curiosity. It sparked an exchange that would change food on both sides of the ocean. Early colonists relied heavily on native techniques in order to survive. Many had arrived without the knowledge of how to grow food in unfamiliar soils, how to fish the rivers, or how to preserve meat through harsh winters. Native communities introduced them to corn, beans, squash, wild rice, cranberries, and countless other foods they had never seen before. The settlers quickly learned that without these contributions, their survival would have been nearly impossible. One of the first lessons came with corn. Europeans had brought wheat and barley, but these crops did not thrive in the new land as easily as corn did. Native people showed them how to plant corn in mounds, often together with beans and squash, the three sisters. The beans added nutrients to the soil, while the broad leaves of squash kept the ground moist and cool. This method was far more sustainable than the farming practices most settlers had known, and it gave them a steady supply of food. Soon, corn became a staple not only in native diets, but also in European households across the colonies. Cooking techniques also fascinated settlers. The idea of cooking food by placing hot stones into water-filled baskets seemed almost magical to outsiders. Yet, this method allowed soups and stews to be made without metal pots. Smoking meat and fish was another practice that quickly spread. Colonists observed how native families built wooden frames over low fires to dry and preserve food, giving it a smoky flavor and making it last for months. These methods were adopted and carried into colonial life, blending with European tastes to create new styles of cooking. The exchange went both ways. Europeans introduced wheat flour, iron pots, livestock like cattle and pigs, and seasonings such as salt and sugar. These new ingredients did not erase native food traditions, but they were woven into them. Cornbread, for example, became a hybrid dish, native corn mixed with European-style baking techniques. Stews once made only with game began to include beef or pork. Maple syrup, which native communities had used for centuries, was combined with imported sugar, creating sweeter dishes that became part of colonial tables. Despite this exchange, differences in foodways remained a source of misunderstanding. Europeans often failed to recognize the spiritual and cultural significance of food in native life. To native communities, corn was more than just a crop. It was a gift from the earth, tied to ceremonies, songs, and prayers. Sharing a meal was an act of respect, not simply nourishment. Settlers, however, sometimes dismissed these traditions as primitive, even while adopting the very foods and methods that kept them alive. This tension showed how food was not only a matter of survival, but also a reflection of worldview. The interaction also revealed contrasts in preservation. Native people had perfected drying, smoking, and fermenting long before Europeans arrived. These methods relied on working with the environment rather than against it. In contrast, Europeans brought salted meats, hard biscuits, and casks of ale across the ocean. Over time, the blending of these methods enriched both cultures. Native people began using iron pots to make stews more efficiently, while colonists depended on smoked venison, dried berries, and cornmeal to sustain them in lean times. Trade became another channel for culinary exchange. Furs, pelts, and other goods were often traded for wheat, sugar, and spices. In return, native foods such as cornmeal, beans, and squash entered European diets. These exchanges shaped the very foundation of what would become American cuisine. Imagine Thanksgiving without corn, pumpkin, or cranberries, all foods that came from native tables. Without this early exchange, the identity of food in the Americas would look very different today. However, the story was not without hardship. As European settlements grew, native communities were pushed off their lands, and with that displacement came changes in access to food. Traditional hunting grounds, fishing rivers, and fertile fields were lost. While some native people continued their traditions, others were forced to adapt to unfamiliar diets that included European rations. This marked the beginning of a long struggle to preserve cultural food practices in the face of pressure and change. Yet, despite these challenges, native cooking did not disappear. Instead, it adapted and endured. Women continued to prepare traditional meals, blending new ingredients with old methods. Ceremonies still included corn, beans, and squash. Families passed recipes and practices down through oral tradition, ensuring that food remained a living link to the past. Even as change swept through their lands, native communities held tightly to the foods that defined their identity. The meeting between Native American cooking and European traditions created something larger than either culture on its own. It laid the foundation for a cuisine that would eventually spread far beyond North America. Corn became a global crop, carried back to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Potatoes, another native food, would change the diets of entire continents. What began as survival lessons between native communities and European settlers reshaped the history of food worldwide. Looking back, this exchange shows how deeply food connects people. It tells a story of cooperation and survival, but also of conflict and misunderstanding. It reminds us that every dish carries a history, whether it's cornmeal porridge once stirred in a clay pot, or bread baked in an iron oven. The legacy of that first contact between native and European food traditions is still alive today, woven into meals that people around the world continue to enjoy. In the heart of every Native American community, meals were far more than a necessity. They were a reflection of the environment, the seasons, and the intricate balance between people and the land. One of the most remarkable aspects of their culinary practices was a reliance on wild foods. Long before agriculture dominated, native peoples were expert foragers, understanding forests, rivers, and plains in ways that few modern people can imagine. They knew which berries ripened at specific times, which roots were edible, which nuts were ripe, and which mushrooms were safe. Their survival depended on this intimate knowledge, and it shaped how they prepared every meal. Foraging was not a casual activity. It required observation, skill, and patience. Native Americans tracked seasonal patterns, noticing when plants flowered, when sap ran in trees, and when certain insects appeared. Each detail signaled the right time to gather a particular food. Wild greens were harvested in spring, tender shoots offering fresh, vitamin-rich leaves. Summer brought berries, nuts, and fruits at their peak sweetness. Autumn provided roots, tubers, and seeds that could be stored for winter months. Even in the harshest environments, such as the northern tundra or arid deserts, they found edible plants that were both nutritious and flavorful. Roots and tubers were central to many meals. The camas bulb in the Pacific Northwest, the Jerusalem artichoke in the Northeast, and wild potatoes in the Andes were staples. These plants were often roasted in earth ovens or boiled using heated stones. The slow cooking transformed hard, fibrous roots into tender, sweet, and earthy dishes. Preparing them required patience, but the reward was a reliable, long-lasting source of nutrition. Some roots were even ground into flour to create porridge or bread, demonstrating both ingenuity and an understanding of food preservation. Nuts were another cornerstone. Hickory, acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts were collected in large quantities during the fall. Acorn, for example, required careful preparation. Their bitterness had to be leached out through repeated washing or boiling before they could be eaten or ground into meal. This meticulous process was passed down through generations, and the resulting flour became a versatile ingredient, used in porridge, bread, or as a thickener for soups and stews. The effort invested in these foods reflected both necessity and respect. Wasting a harvest was unthinkable. Berries and fruits added color, sweetness, and even medicinal benefits to the diet. Blueberries, cranberries, chokecherries, and service berries were eaten fresh, dried for winter, or cooked into sauces. The tartness of these berries balanced the richness of meat and fat, and the sweetness signaled abundance. Some fruits were even fermented to create beverages used in ceremonial contexts. This shows that wild foods were not only sustenance, but also integral to culture, ritual, and social gatherings. Hunting and fishing complemented foraging, creating a balanced diet. Deer, bison, rabbit, and fish were staples, but their preparation was deeply tied to the natural environment. Fish were often smoked along rivers, game roasted over open fires, or cooked in earth ovens. Meat was combined with wild plants to create stews, preserving flavor and nutrition. Even seemingly simple meals were carefully orchestrated, blending the wild with the cultivated, the forest with the fire. Preservation was as important as gathering. Many wild foods were dried, smoked, or stored in cool, dry places to last through the winter. Berries were strung into necklaces and hung to dry. Corn, beans, and squash were stored in granaries, protected from pests and moisture. Meat was smoked or turned into jerky, often with added herbs to prevent spoilage. This foresight ensured that even during the coldest months, communities could enjoy nutritious, flavorful meals. The use of fire was central to all of this. It was more than heat. It was a tool for transformation. Roasting, boiling, steaming, and smoking all depended on careful control of fire and heat. Native cooks understood how to layer food, use hot stones, and trap steam to achieve tenderness and flavor. For example, fish might be wrapped in leaves, placed over glowing embers, and cooked slowly until absorb both heat and aroma. This method preserved moisture, enhanced taste, and made otherwise tough ingredients edible. In addition, wild foods often had medicinal or spiritual significance. Herbs and berries were used not just for taste, but for health. Sage, mint, and sweetgrass could flavor meals while aiding digestion or providing other benefits. Certain roots were valued for their restorative properties. Food and medicine were closely linked, and this knowledge was shared through generations, ensuring that the act of eating was also an act of care. Wild foods also shaped community life. Gathering required cooperation, and feasts celebrated collective effort. Families and tribes often coordinated hunting, fishing, and foraging to maximize efficiency and ensure no one went hungry. The preparation of these foods was a social activity, where knowledge, stories, and values were passed along. Each meal reflected not just sustenance, but a shared understanding of survival, respect, and tradition. Even the simplest wild foods were elevated through technique and combination. Corn roasted with wild herbs, nuts added to stews, or berries mixed with smoked meat created dishes that were both nourishing and flavorful. Each ingredient was chosen deliberately, and the resulting meals reflected a deep connection to the land. The flavors were subtle but complex, derived from the environment itself rather than from imported seasonings. Today, the legacy of these practices continues. Modern chefs and home cooks alike are rediscovering wild foods, foraging, and slow cooking techniques. Native communities maintain traditional food practices, preserving knowledge of edible plants, preparation methods, and seasonal cycles. Every berry picked, root roasted, or fish smoked carries a story, connecting the present to centuries of careful observation, creativity, and respect for nature. The ingenuity of using wild foods reminds us that survival and flavor are not mutually exclusive. Native Americans transformed the land's raw offerings into meals that were nourishing, sustainable, and deeply cultural. They relied on the environment not as a challenge, but as a partner, understanding that every bite was a lesson in patience, skill, and connection. As we reflect on the long and intricate story of how ancient Native Americans prepared their meals, one truth becomes clear. Their cooking was far more than practical skill. It was a profound expression of culture, survival, and connection to the land. Every method they developed, every ingredient they selected, and every meal they shared carried layers of meaning that went beyond hunger. It reflected their intimate understanding of nature, their ingenuity, and their capacity to turn the resources around them into something sustaining, nourishing, and even sacred. At the heart of this culinary tradition was an understanding of balance. Native Americans knew how to combine ingredients to maximize nutrition while also creating flavor. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were a perfect example. These crops supported one another in the field and complemented each other on the plate. Corn provided structure, beans supplied protein and replenished the soil with nitrogen, and squash covered the earth to preserve moisture and deter weeds. When these crops were cooked together, they formed a meal that was balanced, sustaining, and emblematic of the wisdom embedded in their agricultural practices. Beyond the staple crops, the use of wild plants, roots, herbs, and berries reflected a deep knowledge of the environment. They understood what could be eaten fresh, what needed to be cooked, and what required special preparation to be safe. Wild onions, garlic, mint, sage, sweetgrass, blueberries, cranberries, chokecherries, and service berries were used not only for flavor but often for their medicinal qualities. Every meal, even the simplest one, carried the echoes of seasons, climate, and the natural rhythm of life. This was cooking as a form of storytelling, connecting people to the land and to the cycles that sustained them. Fire was more than a tool for cooking. It was a partner in the transformation of food. Techniques like roasting over open flames, steaming with heated stones, smoking meat and fish, and slow cooking in earth ovens were central to their culinary identity. Fire allowed them to soften tough roots, tenderize wild game, extract flavor, and preserve food for later use. Each method required precision and patience. Too much heat could spoil a dish. Too little could leave it undercooked. The mastery of fire reflected not just practical skill, but also a spiritual respect for the forces of nature. Preservation techniques were equally sophisticated. Drying, smoking, fermenting, and storing in cool, dry spaces ensured that food could last through long winters or periods of scarcity. Meat was turned into jerky or pemmican. Berries were dried and strung for storage, and seeds were carefully kept in granaries. These methods reflect a forward-thinking approach to survival, one that demanded attention to detail, patience, and a deep respect for the resources at hand. Wasting food was never an option. Every harvest, every hunt, and every catch was valued and honored. Ceremonial meals were another defining feature of Native culinary life. Food was never simply eaten. It was offered, shared, and celebrated. Feasts marked seasonal cycles, honored successful hunts, and reinforced social bonds within and between communities. Cornmeal might be sprinkled as a prayer, berries shared in celebration, and stews served to bring families together. Through these practices, food became a vehicle for teaching, for transmitting stories, and for embedding cultural values in daily life. Eating was as much about nurturing community as it was about sustaining the body. Women played a pivotal role in all of this. They were the keepers of knowledge, teaching younger generations how to identify edible plants, how to prepare them, and how to combine ingredients for nutrition and flavor. They were responsible for planting and harvesting crops, for preparing meals, and for preserving food for lean times. Their labor was central to the survival of families and communities, and their knowledge ensured that cultural practices endured, even under the pressures of change and displacement. The exchange of food traditions with Europeans added another layer of complexity. While settlers introduced wheat, iron pots, sugar, and livestock, they also learned from native techniques, adopting corn, beans, squash, wild rice, smoked meats, and preservation methods. This interaction shaped American cuisine in profound ways, blending traditions and creating new dishes. Yet, despite these external influences, native culinary practices continue to emphasize sustainability, respect for the land, and the interconnectedness of all living things. One of the most remarkable aspects of Native American foodways is how much they relied on observation, experimentation, and adaptation. By paying attention to the natural world, its rhythms, its cycles, and its signals, They created methods that were both efficient and culturally meaningful. They turned limitations into creativity, scarcity into abundance, and simple ingredients into meals that nourish body and spirit alike. Modern appreciation of native culinary traditions highlights their relevance today. Chefs, historians, and communities are revisiting traditional recipes, cooking methods, and wild foods, realizing that these practices offer lessons not only in flavor, but also in sustainability and respect for the environment. Dishes that rely on local ingredients, seasonal preparation, and minimal waste echo the practices honed over centuries. They remind us that food could be a bridge between people, cultures, and generations, carrying stories and wisdom from the past into the present. Ultimately, the story of how ancient Native Americans prepared meals without modern tools is a story of ingenuity, resilience, and connection. It demonstrates that survival is about more than just meeting basic needs. It is about understanding the world around you, working with it rather than against it, and honoring the sources of life. Every fire built, every stone heated, every berry picked, and every root prepared was part of a system of knowledge that ensured not only survival but cultural continuity. In the end, these culinary traditions remind us that food is never just food. It is history, culture, and community intertwined. It is a reflection of the land, of relationships, and of the care and skill of those who prepare it. Ancient Native Americans transformed their environment into meals that sustain life and nourish the soul. Their legacy is not only in the flavors they created, but in the wisdom embedded in every bite. The patience, observation, creativity, and respect for nature that ensured generations could thrive. As we close this journey through the kitchens of the past, it becomes clear that food is far more than sustenance. It is a story, a connection, and a legacy. Ancient Native Americans taught us that every meal carries meaning, that the earth itself can flavor and nourish, and that survival is woven from respect, skill, and creativity. From a crackling fire to the careful gathering of wild herbs, from the smoke-filled racks of fish to the vibrant colors of berries and corn, every act of cooking was a testament to ingenuity and resilience. Today, their lessons remain urgent and inspiring. In a world dominated by fast, processed meals, these practices remind us to slow down, observe nature, and honor the sources of our food. Imagine preparing a meal with intention, taste with curiosity, and eat with gratitude, not only for nourishment, but for the generations of knowledge behind it. Let this story spark curiosity in your own life. Explore local ingredients, try traditional recipes, and share meals with respect for the environment and the hands that bring food to the table. Because every bite we take can be more than food. It can be a connection to history, culture, and the earth itself.